Whenever my front squats went up, back squats went up, and my sumo got stronger.
Do you feel like for yourself, you just haven't quite reached your potential? Like, is that why you're still doing it?
I definitely feel like my squat and my deadlift, I can hit lifetime PRs. And so that is very motivating. Awesome. I think I've gotten smarter at how to increase my training volume. And I've kind of figured out how much like heavy lifting is enough and what's maybe too much. For me, it's always a matter of like, if I want to lean out, I need to try it. If I want to gain weight, I don't do anything. I just eat. I think with a lot of RPE training, there's like a really good, it's a really great concept, but a lot of people overthink it and they basically outsmart themselves out of like training hard enough. The first thing, for me, the most important thing for sumo was always just doing the block pulls. In my mind, if I yanked the bar hard enough off the floor, I would succeed.
Dan Green, welcome to the show. Great to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark.
Appreciate it. A little bit before the show, we were talking about, some of these younger lifters that are coming along and they're just blazing a trail and like, holy shit, these lifts that people are hitting right now are extraordinary. What do you think is some of the result of that? Like, how come some of these young guys and girls are coming through and just smashing some of these all-time world records?
Yeah, I don't think there's just an obvious trend of like how I would break it down. I see certain lifters that are just, really phenomenal, and each one kind of has their own things that they do that are pretty special, that I would say are like the factors that are kind of getting them ahead of everybody else. When we were talking about Colton, and when I first started watching him, I was seeing the weights he was lifting and the form he was lifting with, and I was kind of doubly impressed. Obviously the weights he was lifting and the control was like, this is like, wow, this is phenomenal. Yeah. But what I also liked and appreciated, and maybe this is, I saw some of the similar technique sort of that I use for myself, kind of the really wide open hips on the squats and the deadlifts.
Very upright position. Yeah.
And I was like, wow, this is like what I envisioned my, my form ascending to. And he's like 24 and he's just got it dialed in like better than I ever did.
He's like, how's this?
But it's like, I see the, taking advantage of like the flexibility that I utilized a lot. And I was just like, wow, that's, I started lifting at 24 and it just took me a while to figure anything out. And he's 24 and he's already the best total in the world.
You started at 24?
As far as like my first powerlifting meet. Yeah.
Okay.
Before that, I was just like, I'm going to the gym to get jacked.
And before that, you were a cheerleader.
There was a a phase of that too. Yeah.
And cheerleading, like people might not like understand, but there's some gymnastics to that a little bit, right?
There's a
balance, coordination, strength.
Yeah, there's a pretty good amount of athleticism. There's one side of it that would be gymnastics, just tumbling stuff, not like, you're just running across doing flips and tumbling. And then there's the other side, which is the stunts. That's where, as a guy, you're usually picking up the girls and doing either partner stunts, which is just like one girl in the air or maybe more, or kind of the pyramids where you're, throwing a couple people up in the air. And so when I started doing it, I was like, this is different, but I had been a gymnast before. So even though I was, pretty strong,
I did not know that.
I had a pretty good background in gymnastics. So
wow.
Yeah, so it suited me well. I like the gymnastics, and essentially it's like if you like lifting weights and you like women, now you're just lifting the women. So it's kind of like it's a good combination. And
you said you were going to do a backflip for us today, right? At 270 pounds.
And then the podcast will be over.
That's all the time we got for today.
The last time I did a flip off our diving board, I was like, all right, I look like a grizzly bear who just fell over.
So you were able to do all that stuff.
I was very good at that, yeah.
Handsprings and all that stuff.
Yeah, when I was like 215 pounds. So.
And do you think that is something that prepared you, for powerlifting? You think that helped with being explosive or just coordination and strength?
As far as the lifting, just generally being athletic was good. So, any sport that you're doing is probably have a way of kind of, making your lifting go better. The things that I definitely took away were, I had a lot of like thoracic mobility, so I could really, kind of extend my upper back. That's good if you want to have a good squat position or a bench arch. And I had a lot of like, hip flexibility. So made squatting in kind of a wide stance just feel really natural. Even though you would think it makes your sumo better, It took me a long time to figure out how to pull sumo. And I think when I was doing it, it just wasn't as popular. So I didn't really have any guidance. It just sort of like, I stumbled upon some stuff that just like worked for me.
It seemed like it might have been important for you because you did have some good mobility through the hips, maybe to build some size. And you have huge legs and a huge lower body. I mean, that must have been a contributing factor. And then what are maybe some things that you did to try to get your legs and hamstrings and stuff to grow?
So the first thing that really was like, that built up my hamstrings a lot, when I was in college, I started doing Romanian deadlifts. But I think that's kind of like a exercise that doesn't really have just like a clear-cut definition of what it is. But the way that I did it, and the way that I think of a Romanian deadlift, is that you're kind of like, you're hinging your hips back, and you typically start the lift from the top, lower a weight. You could or don't have to touch the floor. I think the range of motion is totally debatable how much you should do. And then you return to the top. The way I did it was that
Ryan,
I would...
sorry, 1 second. Ryan, go back up and click on that one in the middle. That gives you a good idea of like what we're talking about with being able to have those hips that way. Yeah, that's like insane posture. And then you're trying to almost maybe maintain that same posture as you use the bar to kind of pull yourself into position. Is that right?
Certainly trying to wedge the hips in there. You know, when I was early in lifting, I got better by going wider. So I would be pretty much like toes out to the bar, chest up. And then as I kind of figured out how to do more, I was like very focused on keeping my back in a more like neutral or slightly rounded position.
I interrupted your Romanian deadlift story, but if you can go back to giving us a little bit more juice on that, because I think some people would probably be really interested in that.
Yeah, there's a pretty old video of me doing like Romanian deadlifts in my garage back in the YouTube channel days. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I would arch my back so I never dropped the chest down, and I would stand on a tall box so that I could basically lower the weight down to the top of my shoes and then come up. So my back was like arched. And that puts a lot of stretch on your hamstrings. And so that really blew up my hamstrings a lot.
Quick question. When you mentioned your back was arched, sometimes when people are doing RDLs, they keep the rib cage over the hips, right? But when you say you were arched, did you like really accentuate extension? Yeah. So were you like kind of open when you were doing it? As in like arched?
Yeah.
Wow.
Like, yeah, if you think stripper picking up money off the floor, arched back, that's what it was. Because then you're not making a lower back. Your lower back is locked. So it just puts all of the stress on the hamstrings.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, if the lower back is rounded, you're pulling a little bit of tension off. It's not like the hamstrings don't get worked at all, but you're pulling some tension off of them, as opposed to when you're arched.
Yeah, and totally. And if there's like I used to sort of subscribe to the idea that the more you could stretch a muscle through a range of motion, then like that's always better. It is better at times. And certainly for this, if you lower all the way where my knees are not locked, but there's a lot of stretch, certainly more stretch with a barbell in your hands than you can achieve with just your body weight. Mm-hmm. So if you lower to the point where your hamstrings are really stretched like that, and then you ask your hamstrings to pull all the weight back up, that's a really intense loading for the hamstring. But if you get into that position and then at that critical moment where the stretch is is increasing the load, then you let your back kind of ease up. Then you kind of diminish the load in that critical position. So being a stickler on the form was pretty key for that. So I did that for like 10 years, and my hamstrings were really, really well developed from that.
All you got to do is do it for 10 years. Yeah, I could see your posture. We're watching a video, and your shoulders are sinking below your hips, which is a difficult position to try to get yourself into.
Yeah, so this video is me doing stiff leg deadlifts. So it got to the point where I did 585 for a set of 5 RDL reps to my shoes.
The RDL would be you being more strict and
this would be much more
probably
arched,
having more tension
starting from the top. I'll have a little wider, like maybe
and not a deficit,
slightly wider. And I was standing on a taller deficit.
Taller deficit. Ooh.
So basically, I wouldn't touch the ground. It would touch the bar would touch my shoes. And I got to the point where I was like, my hamstrings are not the limiting factor. It's my lower back. So that's when I was like, I like the RDLs, but I'm going to switch to stiff legs to try to make it a little bit more about the lower back. And then, and kind of just, even though I like the RDLs, kind of just remove them because it's, if you're being, if you're being, smart about your training, you don't want to just do the things that are like your favorite, like pet exercises.
Was one of your first meets, was it at Super Training? Because there was like some sort of contest there. I think maybe some sort of deadlift type thing. And I think I remember you lifting there.
Oh, yeah.
Doing like a 600-ish pound deadlift. And then years later, you're Dan Green.
Yeah. So that was sort of I was doing some stuff with kettlebells that was sort of just on the side. So they had these competitions called the Tactical Strength Challenge.
That's right.
So I did it in 2009 and 2010, and it was at Super Training. 2009, I think I did like 650 as a conventional deadlift, and that was kind of that was around the point when I was like done conventional deadlifting and switched over to sumo.
Yeah, you were pretty damn big, and I was like, who's this guy? What's going on with this guy?
Yeah.
Because everybody else in there was like fit and everything, but you were pretty big. I was like, holy shit.
Yeah, the next year at 2010, I deadlifted 740, and this was like, I think it was my first time deadlifting on a deadlift bar, at least that I remember. So it felt pretty good. And so you would do like 1 rep max deadlift, and then you would do one set of pull-ups for as many reps as you could do, like strict ones. I was in the elite category where you'd actually do weighted pull-ups. You had like a 22 or 10 kilogram, weight. And then the last event was like 5 minutes max reps on kettlebell snatches.
But one thing I'm really curious about is your development of your erectors, because I've seen you talk about like purposefully stretching that area to cause more growth there. And the interesting thing about that is when I hear a lot of other people, especially like guys that are biomechanical and they're talking about bodybuilding, they always mention, deadlifts don't really work the erectors, right? So what do you think they're getting wrong about that? Because you've done that on purpose.
Yeah. So I think, going back to the way I was describing the RDLs, if you deadlift and you keep your back, isometrically locked, kind of like you'd see in like, Men's Health magazine, where it's like this picture perfect deadlift, you're basically just squatting the weight up. Mm-hmm. So holding your back in kind of like a shortened position might not be the best for growing the erectors.
Yeah.
So that's where if you see somebody who's deadlifted with bad form, like rounding their back a lot for a long time, and they've like survived it, they probably built up their erectors pretty well.
Survive. Okay.
But what I had read, what's the dude? Stuart McGill has like a couple books. One of them was like the, lower back disorders. And then there was kind of like a sequel to that, Ultimate Back Performance. And it was a pretty long title, but I read through that. It's like a textbook, but he really breaks down the mechanics of like rounding your spine, lower back and like upper back. And so from that, I basically was like, okay, you can round your thoracic spine very safely. And you can round your lumbar, but it needs to be pretty controlled. It can be a little bit. And when I say a little bit, you could sort of think if you have like 5 vertebrae in your lower back and the total rounding forward of your lumbar will be like 15 degrees. If you can do 3 degrees 5 times, you have a lot of skill and you're distributing the load pretty effectively. If you have like 10 degrees of rounding in one spot, you probably just hurt your back.
Yeah.
And he even has like studies where he had like 40 lifters that are all lifting, and they're lifting at like 400 pounds and stuff. So they're actually like decent lifters. And he kind of had them all go until there was like an injury. And
whoa,
maybe that sounds like unethical, but I think there's like, and he kind of describes it. He was like, the injury mechanism was that the control of the vertebrae is like, that was what was lacking. So you get like too much flexion in one vertebrae or one joint. And then that's kind of the injury mechanism. So I was like, okay. So what I always saw is like, I have pretty average length arms for my height. And if you see the guys who deadlift a lot with long arms, you're like, okay, well, if I round my upper back, it's like my arms are like 3 inches longer. Mm-hmm. So I would think about that a lot. Like, how do I sort of, cave in my chest more? And then really what I started doing was I started doing a lot of deficit deadlifts. If I'd stand on like a 3.5 inch box, and I would just do all kinds of, I'd do singles, I would do triples, I would do sets of like 5 or 8 volume. So, and the goal there, what I like about that is, one, it lets you experience like rounding your back. Cause you realize early on, you're like, if I try to just keep my back flat and now I'm getting into it, I'm just squatting the weight up from like, super deep. It's not going to feel right. Once you learn that your back can kind of go into a little bit of a rounded position and be stable, and then you can drive up the weight, you can start feeling like, okay, this is actually really good and really strong. Mm-hmm. And so now your erectors are lengthened because your spine is rounded.
Yeah.
And so it builds up the muscle much, much more when the erectors are stabilizing kind of a more lengthened position. Yeah, so that video you can kind of see. For me, it was always kind of that like lower thoracic spot that rounded the most. And that's where I have the most muscle on my lower back or my mid back.
And when you deadlift normally outside of the deficit, do you also allow some of that rounding, or do you maintain a more neutral position with a standard deadlift?
No, there's very few people that I watch who are like top deadlifters who keep their back flat.
Okay.
Now, if you think about this, when you bench, you're basically having to control your shoulders and your elbows. There's not a lot of joints. When you squat, you have to control your knees, your hip flexion, your hip like abduction, and then you've got to control your spine. But you're never really trying to like articulate your spine. You're just trying to keep it braced. But if you take all 17 vertebrae in your spine and you can articulate them, uniquely in a deadlift, you have a lot of options for how well your skill, quote unquote, would be for like creating leverage. So that's where you can deadlift a lot by improving your skill without needing to like bulk up, because you can just increase your leverage. And that's what the deficit does. It lets you use like a percentage of your max and round your back, sort of like you're introducing sort of a controlled chaos, as opposed to only rounding when you hit like 95%. And suddenly it's like,
surprise,
will your back tolerate, lifting, super heavy weights without practicing, lifting in that position? So if you can like repeatedly lift in that rounded position, then you will build up muscle to kind of stabilize that position.
I'm so excited you came here today because I don't see a lot of interviews from Dan Green. You've always been quiet. You've always been humble, but at the same time, you've destroyed all-time world records. And I think you're a favorite of a lot of people. A lot of people are huge fans of yours. I remember, when you came to Super Training, and I would ask you a question, and I was always like, man, every time I ask this guy a question, it just turns out the answer is like a lot of hard work. It's like, I want some different answer, so I could like cheat code my way through life or whatever. But it was always the deadlift party. If you could explain the deadlift party to some people, because you like to party a little differently than maybe everybody else is thinking.
Yeah, well, one more point with the deficits. The thing I said, I was like, there's really two things to it, and I explained kind of the mechanical one. The second thing is that for me, when I did it, I was like, nobody else wants to do these, so it gives me like an edge. So I was saying before, like if you just SBD like everyone else, why would you assume that you'll be better? Unless you just have the genetic like lottery winner. So if you're like, I feel like I have good genetics and good work ethic, and I'm tough enough to like deal with setbacks and, tough training and stuff. But I feel like for all those things, there's better, more gifted people that I compete against. So I need something different to give me an edge. So if I do things in my training that they're not doing, then I'm like, all right, I know in I know that I've prepared to be better, So when I can do something that works and I know that somebody else doesn't want to do it, that gives me a little bit of a mental edge, Now, the deadlift party was, so originally there was a guy that I wound up meeting. His name was Craig Terry, and he died, so rest in peace. But he had been like the top deadlifter in his weight class for like close to like 20 years. He's an older dude, and I went and I saw him work out at a gym in Michigan. Now, this is a guy who's like built for deadlifting. His arms are like reaching down to his kneecaps pretty much. But he did a workout that was basically like, kind of had one set of like max reps of whatever weight it was from the floor. So it's probably, doing like 5 to 8 reps. And then he would put like 5 inches of blocks under the weight, and he would do a little heavier weight, and he would do one set of max reps. And then he would stand on like a 100-pound plate and do like one set of max reps from a deficit with like now a lighter weight. So it's kind of like you did 3 different AMRAP sets from the floor, from blocks, and from a deficit. So I started doing something, and then after that, he just did a bunch of one-arm rows. So that was pretty straightforward, but it was like, oh, that's a little different. I haven't seen people do it, and the dude's, he's a very strong deadlifter. And so I started doing that, and when I started doing that for sumo, I would do like, one set of sumo from the floor, one set of sumo from like 3.5-inch blocks, and then I would do the deficit set conventional. And that's when my sumo really started to blow up. Just because the block pulls sumo like really built up my hip strength, whereas before I was flexible, but it didn't really figure out how to use my hips. So I've had people do all sorts of variations of that, I put the hashtag deadlift party on like some of my videos, and so if you go back through the thousands of videos,
not a lot of people are showing up to that party.
There's like thousands of people with that hashtag, and I'm like, hey, that's cool.
I first started hearing about transcriptions from Thomas DeLauer.
Yep.
And, Thomas is somebody, it's an animal with working out. You got a chance to work out with him. I worked out with him. And he's kind of always on the front lines of like, finding out about these new companies that have cool things. But I didn't really realize that Transcriptions was the first company to put out methylene blue. And now look at methylene blue. It's so popular. It's everywhere.
It's one of those things. If you guys listen to this podcast, I'm very iffy with the supplements that I take. Because there's a lot of shady stuff out there.
You got to be careful.
The great thing about Transcriptions is that when people want to get methylene blue, usually they'll go on Amazon, they're going on these other sites. It's not third-party tested. It's not dosed. A lot of people end up with toxicity from the blue that they get because there's no testing of it. Transcriptions, they have third-party testing for their products. It's dosed, so you know easily what exact dose of methylene blue you're getting in each trochee. So you're not making some type of mistake. There's not going to be anything in it. It's safe.
You can have it dissolve and you can turn your whole world blue if you want, or you can just swallow it. They have two different types of methylene blue. They have one that is, I believe, dosed at 16 milligrams, and they have another one that's dosed at 50 milligrams. So make sure you check the milligrams. I don't recommend anybody start at 50 milligrams, but the 16 I feel is very safe. You can also score the trochees and you can break them up into smaller bits.
Yeah, that's what I do.
And in addition to that, on top of the methylene blue, they have a lot of other great products and stuff as well. They got stuff for sleep. They got stuff for calming down, all kinds of things.
I gotta say, I use it about 2 or 3 times a week. I use it before jiu-jitsu. And the cool thing that I've noticed, and I've paid attention to this over the past few months, is that after sessions, I don't feel as tired. So it's almost like I've become more efficient with just the way I use my body in these hard sessions of grappling. And it's like, cool, that means that, I could go for longer if I wanted to, and my recovery is better affected. It's pretty great.
I know Dr. Scott Schur, we had him on the podcast, and he talked quite a bit about how he recommends methylene blue to a lot of the athletes that he works with.
Yeah.
And they're seeing some profound impacts. And one of the things I've heard about it is that it can enhance red light. So those of you doing red light therapy, or those of you that have some opportunities to get out into some good sunlight, it might be a good idea to try some methylene blue before you go out on your walk or run outside or whatever activity it is that you're going to do outside.
And this stuff is great, but please, first off, they have that stuff for staying calm. They have stuff for sleep. But remember, this stuff isn't a substitution for sleep. This isn't a substitution for taking care of your nutrition. This is supposed to be an add-on to all the things that we already should be doing. And it's going to make things so much better if you're doing everything else too.
And I think this is just a little different too than just adding some magnesium to your diet. I think this is a little different than... Yeah. Treat these things appropriately. Make sure you do some of your own research. But
if you're taking medications, SSRIs, you better talk to your doctor first. Don't be popping these things.
And if you're taking any medications at all, it'd be good to double, triple, quadruple check and make sure that you're safe. Transcriptions has a lot of great things that you need, so go and check out their website when you have the opportunity. Strength is never weakness, weakness never strength. Catch you guys later.
But that was the original version. It was kind of like doing multiple different deadlifts in the same workout, and
for a lot of volume, though, too.
Yeah, certainly, right? With with some intensity, not like just kind of going through the motions.
Yeah. How many days a week did you do that? Was it 1 day a week you'd do this?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, if anyone wants to try that, there's what I would generally say is that can be done about 2 weeks out of 4. If you try to do it every week, it feels like it kind of works and then it stops. But if you're a little more conservative and you're not going for like AMRAP every workout, you can pace it a little bit better.
So basically it's a deadlift of some sort, deficit deadlift, and a bent over row.
Deadlift, block pull, and then a deficit.
I got you. Okay.
Yeah.
3 different styles of,
or
3 different angles, right? 3 different angles of hitting a deadlift.
And so the thing there is like when you deadlift from different heights, you're teaching your body to kind of learn how to just leverage itself. So when you start in a blocks, a lot of conventional pullers struggle with that. And I think it's because when you bend down to the weight, the natural like lengthening of the erectors and the hamstrings creates passive tension. So when you reach down far enough, it's easy to get tight, even if you're rounded over. But when you can't bend down, as far, maybe it's like 5 inches or 6 inches, now you've got to sort of isometrically contract those muscles. So even though your legs are stronger from a taller position, it's harder to get all that posterior chain like tension.
This also this makes a lot of sense why you're so physically developed in a sense, because
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
if you do just one
fucking
deadlift,
jacked.
yeah, if you do just one deadlift in a certain way, you're perfect at leveraging that way. But you said it perfectly. You're learning how to leverage in all these different positions, activating in differently with at the initiation of each lift.
That was a fun day. I had this one buddy who I would train with, and he's the guy who would show up with like 135 pounds, and he'd be like pacing back and forth, ready to just like scream and like, I'm like, it's 135. And then, he was strong. He was like a 700-pound deadlifter.
Okay.
But whenever we would train together, I always wound up having like some of the best workouts.
Because he was so amped up.
Yeah, I was just like, well, I can't just kind of like stop there. So the day that I did the like 1,000-pound block pull off the 2x4s, he was there, his sister was there, and I was just like, okay, we'll just do it.
It's a wild looking lift right here.
Yeah. So that was I mean, I can't say that that's necessarily useful,
but fun.
But
What's the weight on the bar there?
That's 1,003. So yeah, that just sort of happened. But if you do the block pulls, a lot of people will be like, oh, it's like cheating. You're just doing it for ego. So usually I would do like triples or maybe sets of 5, and you can build up some serious muscle. Like especially for sumo, it's a huge advantage. So I would always use just like a 3.5 inch, 2x4s or 3.5 inches. So using that much height makes it so, you want to kind of lift, maybe 10% over your max, but not really more than that. So if you can rep, 105 or 110% of your max, you can build up your traps, your obliques a lot. I mean, your traps will get huge from, repping super maximal weights, and your hips will get very strong. Your glute medius. So those are all kind of the sumo muscles. And what I always also would say is like pulling off blocks, you would think this builds up your lockout, but if you're just like ripping the bar, maybe, but I always felt like pulling off blocks teaches you how to brace for the start. The hardest part in blocks is getting it moving, and then it's kind of a short stroke. Whereas the deficit teaches you how to finish a lift. You're lifting with your back in a compromised position. You got to lift in that compromised position, the extra 3 inches, and then you've got to lock it out. So your erectors, even though you're being in a deficit, makes your erectors work from a flexed position. And so that is where it really builds your kind of your finishing strength, all the posterior chain muscles. So it's a little counterintuitive, but once you kind of think of it that way and you do it, you can realize, okay, the blocks, it's hard to get the weight just to budge off the platform, and then it's fine.
You used a lot of conventional exercises to make a lot of progress, and I think at the time you were doing it, there was other people doing it, but Westside Barbell was pretty powerful at the time.
Yeah.
And then I believe you wrote an article called Westside, right?
Oh yeah.
And this was the Dan Green, coming in with the steel chair heel turn because all the West
RKO out of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Dan Green RKO. I don't know. Oh my God. Because no one really touched Westside Barbell. Some people would. Some people say it doesn't make any sense. And you had Chad Wesley Smith and some people with their conjectures about what Louis did at the safety bar and the cambered bar, and all those guys are just on a bunch of juice, and whatever the case was. The speed work doesn't work, or whatever the different things were that talked about it. But this article was really shook things up a lot. And I remember, because I went to Westside Barbell, trained with him, and Louis Simmons was my mentor and so on. And I was not mad about this by any means. I thought that it was great because it's like, we need this.
Definitely stirred things up.
Yeah, it stirred the pot.
Entertaining.
And, I don't know, how did you feel after you put that article out? And
I mean, well, first off, I've met Louis a few times, and rest in peace. He was a pretty awesome dude to run into, and I did a podcast with him later on. But one of the things I remember from some of his articles, so he wrote articles about who trains harder, basically people who juice or people who don't, and he was like, lifters who juice can train much, much harder, no matter what. And then he goes, but lifters who are natural, they need to train much, much harder. They need to build up their training, and they need to train that much harder to kind of build up their ability to recover. And I was like, those are kind of like contradictory points, But then if you sort of just take the real between the lines element, which is like, okay, so lifters who juice can train harder, but lifters who don't need to train harder. I was like, so the point is, everyone needs to train harder.
Oh, I thought the point was everyone should be on the juice.
And, so that was always one of the things that, I think I've run into a lot of people where I'm like, it doesn't matter what your training program is if you're not training hard. Like, if you're just expecting the gains to just happen because you're following a routine.
Well, one of the biggest deals about Westside Barbell was people training together and people with common ground, right? Like
people who are probably not going to let you just kind of phone it in.
Exactly. Like people just working hard and making and critiquing each other on their squat form, their bench form, their deadlift form. Everyone there has the same goal. Everyone wants to get better. We talked about it a lot inside the walls of Westside. We'd say, I wonder what would happen if we just did a different program. We'd probably end up with similar results because we're all trying to get stronger, and that's all we care about.
Yeah, and I feel like the flip side though is like whichever program you put yourself into, as long as it's reasonable, if you're like putting that effort into it, you're going to make it work.
Yeah.
But as far as the article, the West to Westside article, one of the things that I had always done in my career, because I never had a coach, I did have Josh Bryant helping me for a little while, but I wound up getting hurt, and so not because of him. I hurt myself deadlifting my shoulder, and so the bench coaching that he was doing for me just kind of was like, okay, I can't really bench much now. But everything I learned was kind of from observing, and there's always that thought of like, if you go to a gym like Westside or you go to a gym where there's stronger people than you, then you'll learn more. But I was always training at like Gold's Gym, and I was probably the strongest person. But I would always seek out competition in the form of meets. So, I would be signed up to go to one meet, and as I'm training for it, and I would see somebody get a result that's better at a new meet, and I was like, all right, well now I've got my sights set. And eventually I went to, this was back in the powerliftingwatch.com days.
Oh yeah.
There was a listing for like, hey, we need American lifters to go and do this meet in Russia. And so I was like, well, I'm not really anybody at this point. It was like 2010. And so I was like, hey, I'll go if there's an opening. And it wound up being just like 3 people. It was like me, Philip Brewer, and Jeremy Hornstone. They're both like, bench monsters. Mm-hmm. And so I go over there, and, the whole situation of going to Russia where like nobody speaks English was like pretty daunting in the first place. I felt like I was in like, some movie like The Hostel and get like kidnapped somewhere.
Who's going to kidnap you, Tom?
Well, like getting in a taxi and they're like driving you. They don't take the freeway because the freeway is just gridlocked. They're driving you past all these like industrial factories and stuff, and you're just like, no idea where they're taking me. Hopefully to the hotel, but who knows? So when I went to the meet, eventually, like the people at the meet were like all the best lifters in the world. Like Zahir and Andrei Milanichev. The meet was won by Andrei Belayev. He was a 220 guy, and he set the world record at like 2,093 pounds. There was another 220, Konstantin Pozdiev. He squatted the world record. It was like 815, and then he tried 859. So back in the day, that was the world record. But I saw these guys, and I was like, they don't do anything like what I've thought of from Westside training. They don't warm up in the meet like I've seen at all the American meets. When I was watching them warm up, the monolift, I don't know how many people watching, have seen this for like lifted trucks, but if you have a lifted truck, you got to get one of those like special jacks to like lift your truck if you have a flat tire. The monolifts didn't just have normal hooks. They had like those like skyjacker like jacks installed on them. I was like, I don't know who made that, but it's kind of sick. I don't know why they couldn't just get a normal one, but I'm like, okay. All the equipment was just kind of like crude and rudimentary, but they're all just like, just focused. Everyone, my first impression was everybody looked like at some point when they were a kid, they learned to crawl and then to walk and then to squat. And somebody taught them when they were probably like 6 and they'd never done the squats like incorrectly and then had to like unlearn it and do it right. It was like somebody just taught them how to do it right from like a young age. And it was so clear in the form that it was like, it's the same every time.
All of them.
They all looked like,
wow.
The form was just like drilled into them from like a long time ago.
You could see it in the warm-up room with the bar. When they just had the bar, the American lifters sometimes with the bar wouldn't create enough tension to like push them down or whatever. And American lifters just going to kind of like use their back to do like the bar. The Russian lifters get right underneath there. No mobility problems in their shoulders whatsoever. Their hands are super close. They get right underneath there, and they can do a full squat, whether there's 100 pounds on there or whether there's 300 pounds or 800 pounds or 900 pounds.
Yeah, and also in the warm-ups, they're like stoic, not hyped up. Whereas in like most American meets, I would go there and people are like trying to lift, 135 like as fast as possible, and
Was there any
super
music?
amped up. It was just like everyone just kind of milling around, kind of quietly, and it was like, okay, this is different.
Pantera isn't blasting for your warm-ups. Yeah.
Yeah, people were not screaming at their like training partner to like get amped up for their like 405 deadlift. It was I was like, oh, they're just waiting for the meet. I was like, that's so starkly different. And then watch the meet, and they're all squatting these like enormous weights. And and I remember seeing like, damn, these guys have huge quads. Like I never really, that's always like de-emphasized in like, kind of the Westside training. It was like, oh, quads are like,
Posterior
trophies or-
chain, yeah.
Yeah. And so I remember I saw Konstantin Pozdiev bench. And when I was going out to bench, I did like a triple take, literally, because I saw his quads, and like I looked 3 times before I realized like that's his quads. It looked like there was just like this shelf of something over his kneecaps, and I'm like, oh, that's a lot different than what I've ever seen. So I was like, my quads look like they kind of taper from my hips down to my knees, and his just looked like a cylinder. There's like no taper, just all thickness at the knees. And I was like, okay, that's a lot different. And so, yeah, I kind of pieced together myself, okay, I need to be training my quads. And then eventually it was the same thing with the bench. It's like, you got to develop your chest, not just your triceps and not just your lats. So, and it was pretty clear that like a lot of the stuff that works in geared lifting probably works in raw, but a lot of it is not good enough. And that was a lot of what Westside was just sort of like, hey, the things that work for geared lifting are maybe not the things that are going to work for everybody for like raw lifting. And here's some things that I've noticed. So
How were you able to put on like so much muscle mass? You did give us a brief idea, with some of the stuff you did for your deadlift and stuff like that. But was there any attention to hypertrophy, like actual hypertrophy blocks where you would do, sets of 10 and stuff like that? Or did you kind of do some of that minimally?
I think for the upper body, I had always done a lot of high volume lifting before I was competing in powerlifting. And then when I kind of reintroduced it, not in the sets of 10 necessarily, but like many, many sets of like 5, sets of 6, things like that, it definitely started to, increase my chest size. I did a lot of dumbbell training and overhead press training, dumbbell overhead press training. So a lot of like, I feel like bodybuilders figured out a long time ago that dumbbells make you bigger. So that's like, if you're not utilizing that, you're kind of like missing out, I think. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of top lifters have, advised younger lifters to like gain some muscle and not be skinny so much. And, so I definitely did that. For the lower body, the thing that really worked the most for me was when I started training my quads, the first thing I tried was like, I'm going to do some like leg presses, and, that, pumps up the quads. I don't know that it really made a huge difference. And then a few weeks after that, I was like, all right, I'm going to do some front squats. So I did the front squats, and it would be kind of like after my back squats. And I found like some of the time I had a good workout, some of the time I didn't. And then eventually what I did that really changed the game for me was I put the front squats on their own day. So they were like the first exercise of the day. And then based on some like conversations I had with Sam Bird, he kind of told me he does like a back squat day and then he does like a front squat day. Back squat day for him was more focused on speed, and the front squat day was like kind of a bodybuilder day, like 3 sets of 5 to 8 kind of thing. So I was like, you're doing more intensity on your front squats than your back squats is what I took away from that. And so I started doing the front squats on their own day, trying to get in that like 5 to 8 rep range. And that just really never stopped working for me. I think when I started doing that, my squat was around 615. And in 2 years, I was up to 815. And my front squat went from like 405 to about 600. So it was just a lot of never ending gains from the front squatting. And a lot of size from the front squatting. So the way I saw it for me was like the low bar training was, you got to master your craft. You also, when you have sets of like 5 with a low bar, it's a lot of time with weight on your back. So your back gets strong from that. And then I would do a lot of high bar pause squatting. And that also really helps you to like learn how to use the quads in a back squat. And also when you pause at the bottom, you really build your skill and confidence, how to be stable and how to be explosive out of the bottom. And then the front squat was like, it was the hypertrophy. That was the thing. So whenever my front squats went up, back squats went up, and my sumo got stronger. So
it wasn't like there was a lot of attention to like machines or anything, leg extensions, leg curls, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't think I did any of that for like years and years. The only machine I would touch would be I have a hack squat, and I'll do. Sometimes I would do that, but that was never like a staple.
There's a ton of questions from people, but as you were talking about this, I was looking for a specific question I saw, and I've never seen you do this, but someone who's apparently watched a lot of your training wanted to know what made you start doing barbell Bulgarian split squats. And I don't know if that was a big part of your training, but did you start doing that also in effect to try to, bring more size to your quads?
No. So,
okay, looks like not.
No, but I mean, that was when I was like about 39. So that was when I was already like, I hadn't competed in like 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
I'd had quad surgery. I'd had bicep tear surgery. I had my elbow surgery for like, bone spurs. Then I had 3 more kids. So I hadn't competed in like a long time. And there was COVID. And so I started, training for a meet. This was 2021. I competed, I think like December. And so during that training phase, it was pretty clear, like my quads were strong, but like only my right glute was really firing, and I'd be shifting a lot to one side. And so I managed to hit a PR of 804, and it was like pretty clear that when I come out of the hole, like I didn't hit that second gear because it was basically like above parallel, below parallel, just your mass kind of rebounds you. You get that passive like reflex, or you get that stretch reflex from just like mass and the passive tension you build up. But above parallel, I would just shift to my right side because my right hip was strong and my left hip was kind of not really firing up. So in the next year, I was doing some training and I started doing the Bulgarians. And what I decided was, I was like, well, if I always get stuck above parallel, I'm going to restrict the Bulgarians to kind of like above parallel. Whereas in the past, I think I mentioned before, I've been kind of just like, it's always better to do more range of motion. And, one time I had done a lot of range of motion and it was like, kind of felt the hip flexor strain. So I was like, all right, that's kind of foolish. So when I started doing the split squats with a limited range of motion, that really started to turn my glute back on. And then my squats kind of started shooting up. And so I was like, oh, this is pretty sweet. I was doing a lot of safety bar squats and I started hitting PRs on those. So I started doing that just more recently in the last couple of years, but I think they're pretty good. And I think that kind of limited range seems to be like better. There's definitely a tendency just philosophically to think, well, if I can use more weight and more range of motion, like sometimes you need to pick the one thing that's more important and then not like make it kind of get muddied up by trying to prioritize more than one thing, which then, you have this convoluted sort of like priority thing. So
we were talking about Colton and him hitting those numbers recently, and it looks like he's got room to hit bigger weights. Do you think that kind of just automatically moves him into being like the greatest of all time? Or does he have to like go and do it more?
I mean, certainly in one regard, it's like the best, one of the things about powerlifting is once you lift the weight once, it's like, that's there forever,
Yeah.
So
that's the biggest total in history for raw lifting, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a side of me that's like, I want to prove that I can still lift, but there's also a side of me where people come up and like, hey, you watched your lifting and,
right.
I was pretty stoked about it. So yeah, those things kind of are there forever. Now, I mean, yeah, is he going to do it forever? I don't know. That would be, the more he does, the more like that's going to be even more remarkable. So
it'd be harder and harder to catch up to him.
I don't think anyone's catching up to him for a while, but just it's very impressive. So
do you feel like for yourself, you just haven't quite reached your potential? Like, is that why you're still doing it? Still chasing after it?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would definitely say that's part of it,
or maybe you didn't like leave on your own terms, sort of like ended up with some injuries and a quad surgery and stuff like that.
I definitely feel like my squat and my deadlift, I can hit, lifetime PRs. And so that is very motivating.
Awesome. That's awesome.
I had some injuries from my neck that kind of have like caused my bench to really, really suck now, or not, just not be very fun to kind of like, train. But squatting and deadlifting, I still feel like there's sort of new methods and, new territory to kind of make that I find motivating. So
and you curtailed your training a little bit because you already built the mass, you already built the structure, you already know how to squat, you already know how to deadlift. So I'd imagine maybe the intensity and volume doesn't need, I mean, you still got to kick it into high gear. There's no question about that. But have you been able to back down a little bit with some of the stuff you were doing when you were younger and still get great results?
Yeah, no, I think I always, it's always important to distinguish, when we say intensity, for me, a lot of times that just meant like pushing myself really hard or maybe doing the most reps in a set that I could do, where it's sort of the more classic, lifter definition is like % of 1 rep max. So certainly for me, the two things I think that you need to do if you're trying to, peak your training or just improve your strength in the long term is you have to constantly pursue perfect form. And you can't really do that without some amount of heavy lifting. And you have to increase your training volume. So I think I've gotten smarter at how to increase my training volume. And I've kind of figured out how much like heavy lifting is enough and what's maybe too much. So I'm definitely sort of trying to be more strategic. Also, I think with the building the volume, the other thing that I think is good is unless you're just like built to squat or deadlift or bench, then there's probably a sort of a version of the squat or bench or deadlift that might suit you better for building volume. So if you like
Westside barbell,
Steffi
baby.
Cohn and you're like, your deadlift form is really perfect and you want to do like, 20 reps of deadlifts, that could be great. But for me, I feel like I need to do some variations of deadlift to really build up my biggest strength. So a lot of times the workout would look like, kind of one top set of deadlifts, and then I would use some secondary lift, like a pause deadlift or a deficit deadlift, and I would build up volume with that.
So Mark, you have been loving wearing these Paluvas for a long time. Why is it that you like these shoes that look like this?
I'm trying to get my feet to be jacked. I think it's funny how sometimes people will, when I wear these shoes, they're like, oh, those are different. And I'm like, well, maybe you should blame God because this is the human foot. This is the way that it looks. But Paluvas are awesome because it's going to allow you to train your feet and train your toes and allow for that toe spread because you got the 5-finger toe thing going on. It's like put on a glove for your feet. It feels amazing.
It's like walking around with toe spacers. We've been working on our feet for a long time now. You always hear the benefit of people talking about like these tribes who have gone without shoes forever. And they have this toe space and have these amazing feet. And these shoes will allow you to just passively get that back by walking around.
You don't realize what a disadvantage you're at when your foot is all clumped together from the football cleats or soccer cleats or whatever else you were wearing when you were young. And so it's nice to be able to splay your toes. In addition to that, though, one thing I love about Paluva is the fact that it's not a regular barefoot shoe. I do love barefoot shoes as well, but it also has appropriate padding. And when you're stepping on some crazy pebbles and rocks and different things, like when I'm out on a run, some terrain is a little different than others. I don't have to be worried that I'm going to get some sort of stabbing, crazy thing happening to my foot because it has an appropriate amount of cushion underneath the foot.
And guys, Paluva has a lot of different styles on their website. I think one of the newest styles they just came out with, which is a little bit more of a rigorous shoe, is the Strand ATR. It's not these are the Strands, but the ATRs have a little bit more. If you want to go hiking with them, you totally can.
Those are amazing. If you go out, throw those on and go sprint on a field and your feet feel so strong, grabbing the grass and being able to actually grab the ground with your foot feels amazing.
I'm more of a chill guy with my Paluva, so I like the Zen slip-ons, but that's the thing. With Paluva, there's a lot of different options. So if you head to paluva.com and use code POWERPROJECT, you'll be able to save 15% off your entire purchase. And they also have toe socks. Their 5-finger toe socks are no show, so check those out too.
And instead of the way I used to do, which is usually like kind of one max set of reps, it would be more like maybe my 8 rep max, but I'm doing like 5x5 with it. So a better way to kind of build up more total reps. And I saw that kind of working better for me. So
you mentioned that you had a quad, bicep, neck. I don't know if there were any other injuries, but I think
it's a pretty good number.
So this is one of the really cool things about being able to talk with you is you have so much experience. And I wonder for a lot of the younger lifters that are listening that are, they want to become super strong or they already are. What are some things that maybe you wish you had in your training that maybe could have prevented some potential injuries? Or you already just mentioned something right here about the way you work with volume, like figuring that out. What are some other things that you think could definitely have helped?
Yeah, certainly the two things that I would think of that come to mind for me would be, like for example, like with deadlifting, having a cleaner form where you're not yanking the bar off the ground, but you're, kind of pulling the slack out. And that can still look very aggressive, and it can look more aggressive for one person than the next. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of acceptably good form, with idiosyncrasy from person to person. But certainly I had form where I would just be like trying to, it was like in my mind, if I yanked the bar hard enough off the floor, I would succeed. And so like obviously there's no amount of force at the floor that completes the lift for you right there. You've got to, get in position to actually like drive it all the way up. So certainly like getting good form is a key thing to kind of preserving yourself. If your bench or your squat is uneven, you're putting undue stress on some joint more than another.
Can you maybe describe a little bit of what you're trying to do when you're deadlifting? Because I remember seeing you do like some deadlifts in meets where you're kind of excited, you're kind of fired up. I mean, you were always pretty calm, but you were excited, to do the lift, and you'd go out and you just like tug the bar. Yeah. And you weren't even in position yet, and the bar would like almost come off the ground. I was always like, holy shit. Yeah. Like I've never really seen anyone do that before. What's kind of going through your head? What are you working on to be able to get yourself in good position for a big pull?
Yeah, well, I would say in the earlier days, it was just like being as aggressive as I could, kind of dropping the hips and then pulling up and back as hard as I could. So there were, it probably took me like 3 or 4, hamstring tears to like figure out that there was like a better way. But I definitely tore my hamstrings like repeatedly.
I meant more like a paper towel, but do you have see if you can find a paper towel. Where are they? Oh, I don't know. Just try to see if we can find some.
Yeah, so a lot of hamstring tears from like kind of poor deadlifting form, or just maybe over aggressive ones. But
it's been a while since we had like a real power lifter on the show, and sometimes they get a little sweaty.
Yeah. But I think the other thing, like I had done in this video here where I'm doing like 900 and I don't have a belt. What I was thinking for that was like just as important as getting strong is I need to not get hurt leading up to the competition, to the event. And so in my mind, I was like, okay, what are the things that are going to probably be the places I get hurt? And it was like, okay, I don't want to tear my hamstring. I don't want to hurt my lower back. I don't want to, tear my lats. And so my training was basically like, all right, I need to handle these like hard sets and hard volume to get stronger. But I also like, okay, I need to maintain a certain amount of strength with my sit-ups. If your stomach is strong, then your back is more supported, especially with no belt. So I would do, I had kind of a rotation of like straight leg sit-ups with the weight behind my head, incline sit-ups with the weight on my chest. I would do like the ab wheel, just, on my toes for some reps and some like hanging leg raises. So I was like, as long as I can have a certain standard of that, I'm not like overdoing it, but I'm not neglecting it. That'll help to preserve my lower back to tolerate the training, and then for hamstrings, I was like, I'm not trying to build mass, but I am doing just kind of a minimal amount of like GHRs just to make sure the tendons feel like they get some stimulus. So that was the other thing. It's sort of like knowing where your body might have sort of vulnerabilities and just addressing them, not trying to, so I would just want to be where I'm like, I can do the sit-ups with like a 60-pound dumbbell, but not like then thinking, well, if I can do it with a 100-pound dumbbell, what can I deadlift now? I was like, no, I know that's not going to be the weak link if I can do it with the 60-pound dumbbell, but doing more is not going to, it's just going to put me in harm's way. It's not going to make me deadlift more. So that was one of the most successful buildups for me. And it was because it was like, all right, I just kind of knew where I might derail myself, and I was able to just stick to the script and kind of,
Sure, that'll work. Thank you, sir. All right, here's a little towel if you want to wipe yourself off.
Getting a little too excited here.
Leave it right here if you need it. Anyway, those front squats are actually like really brutal. I've never been like man enough to go through like and handle some front squats.
Did you ever put like squat shoes on, or are you always flats?
I tried to do it. Yeah, I've tried it a little bit with some squat shoes or with some 10-pound plates underneath my heels or whatever. And it's fun. It's interesting because I sucked at them so bad that it would have probably been the thing to like help me get more progress or to allow me to hold myself a little bit more upright. And it's just interesting how when you're trying to find like weak points, but sometimes you find like a certain weak point where it's like demoralizing. And you're like, I don't know if I should really even mess with that one. What are some things that you've done like from a recovery standpoint in your workouts, in terms of like, I don't know, do you do any like myofascial release stuff? Do you go to a massage therapist, or any of those things, especially coming off of like, torn muscles and torn ligaments and so forth?
I've probably gone through like the gauntlet of different things. We used to have like Jordan was a chiropractor at our gym, and he'd do a lot of like ART and some, different like muscle stuff like PNF stretching and, some adjustments. And, I've done like electro-stim. I feel like that didn't do a whole lot. Right. I've done, at one point when I was younger, I liked doing contrast showers. So that's really good. Or bath, I think, is even better if you have like 2 baths to go in. But that's basically the idea of like, getting in the shower and as you getting it like hot where you're sweating. And then this works better in the wintertime, but you flip it to the cold water and you just tolerate that for about like, a minute to 2 minutes. And now, you're like shivering. You're like, I don't want to do this. And then you crank back the hot water. And to me, so this is like the approach that I have for like all electronics, which is like, you're just hitting the reset button. So your circulation increases while the water is hot. And then it sort of like retracts away from your, limbs and into the core of your body when you go into the cold. And then the moment you put the hot water back on, it sort of like flushes back out through your circulatory system. And I think it really like, sometimes you get like knotted up muscles, the circulation kind of sucks. And then when you hit that like hot, cold, hot, and you reset it, it flushes through those kind of like congested, arteries and veins and stuff. So for things like knots in the hamstrings and the back, that felt like it worked really good. For a while to use the shower, and then we had one house that we were renting that had like a pool and a hot tub, so that would be pretty good as well. I've gotten like massages. There's a place where the women do like they like walk on your back, and that feels pretty good. So definitely I've used that for like when I was doing my meet or the lifting for the the cage. So just try to something. I don't think anything is like a miracle. I think you have to kind of start with smart training and good high protein diet and that sort of thing. So
was there any like writing on the wall, like when you would get injured where you're like, oh man, there was a couple clues there. I should have kind of paid attention to that.
Definitely hindsight is 2020. And, like I've probably torn my hamstrings like 4 or 5 times. So, sometimes you're not smart enough to like pay attention to the message and you do it again. But yeah, I mean, like sometimes you do learn. You're like, okay, these are the things I need to not do. These are the things that will help me to kind of stay healthy.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, definitely have to evolve. And yeah, so I think I've learned a lot of the lessons just because I feel like I'm like not smart enough to retire when I've gotten hurt. I'm still here. And then you try the things and you're like, I'm not going to do that thing again. That kind of got me in trouble. So
I'm curious about this, man, because as you were talking about those Russian lifters, something that you all, you see it in competition, and I wonder about it in training, but it's almost like they always have a little bit left in the tank. It's always like even after like a lot of their third attempts, they could have done more, but that third attempt was heavy and clean. So it makes me think that they're probably very good at selecting good weights in training where they don't push too much. And one thing I noticed with I think it happens to everybody is, you're excited on a certain day and you probably work with weights you shouldn't. Maybe it works well that day, but you build that habit and then one day it just doesn't, right? How do you think a lifter should gauge if they know that they want to go heavy on a certain day? How heavy is heavy enough?
Okay, well, if you're talking about like, let's say for a competition, because that's where it's like, if you're trying to decide, you've got to be able to, first of all, from like that sports psychology standpoint, if you're the lifter, on one side, you should be thinking like, I could lift any weight. And on the other side, you should be like, what's a good strategy? What's going to be a weight I can actually lift? But the problem is a lot of people are like overcautious, and a lot of people are not good at judging their limits because they're overly aggressive. So
yeah.
That's a pretty, I think you could probably write a book about trying to gauge your own ability. But a lot of people do kind of talk themselves down and, so that part, I don't know, you have to kind of, I think having a coach who can objectively like watch you and be like, yeah, you think you can lift 30 more pounds, but we're going to do like 10 more pounds, So sometimes you need the helper to be, the voice of reason while you're just kind of like ready to run through a wall.
And then on like the training side of things, like training day to day, because one thing is like, somebody gets into powerlifting, they want to gain strength fast, but strength does take time. For most people, vast majority of people, strength does take a lot of time. But when you see people lifting 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you want to almost try to speed run it, even though that's not a great idea. So what would your advice be on like being patient with training and picking correct numbers in training?
I mean, I feel like there's a lot of ways you can go. I mean, a lot of lifters I've seen who are younger, they'll do meets like 4 or 5 times a year. And, you know, so the ability to kind of go heavy, you know, make it or not make it, and then go back to training. And I think, most people respond really well to training when they're younger, assuming they train hard. You know, if you train hard, you might make some mistakes and set yourself back. But, and if you're just very cautious, then I think what you're asking is kind of irrelevant because they're already pacing yourself maybe too much.
Yes.
So I think, you have to just kind of have a little trial and error, and then you'll probably find sometimes that, if you do it on your own, maybe you overdo it. I mean, honestly, if you do it on your own and you can't get it right, you should have somebody help you. If you hire a coach, then you should be at that point where you're like, I want to lift more, but my coach is like holding me back. So when the meet comes, you're like hungry.
Yeah.
Like when I did the 900 deadlift in the animal cage, in that training, the story behind that for me was like a year before that, I had torn my quad and I had the quad reattached surgically. And so when I started training again, usually I would squat twice a week. So I do like back squats and front squats or maybe some safety squats. And when I started training back, every time I would do a squat workout, it was like, I can't really just get quad dominant. And it was like, I would lift and then I would be pretty stiff for a few days. So I could only squat like once a week. And it was really just like a good morning with my knees bent. So I was like, well, I can't sumo really. So I'll just conventional pull. And so at the time, my best sumo was 880, but my best conventional was 780. So like a huge difference. And so I didn't know, like, should I be basing my training on 780 or on 880? So I didn't really know. But eventually, I was getting stronger and I made a breakthrough on my form. And so before I did the 900 in the cage, like I kind of set out to do it. Like once I made 850 in training, I was like, I feel like I don't know why, but I feel like I could do that. And so in the training, the heaviest I did was 865. And in one side, I was like, I know that I just need to do certain weights to kind of be ready to make an attempt. But I also know, and this is where a lot of people run into an issue. If you lack mental strength, then you will not feel confident to keep your training under wraps and then just wait for the meet to take that like adrenaline fueled attempt. So you will be like, the only way I'll know if I can do 900 in this event is if I do it in training like 5 times. And then that may not help. It might actually cause you to get hurt and then not do it, or maybe cause you to peak your training too soon. So being able to kind of know like, what do I need to do to stimulate physically, and then mentally, how do I know how to be strong enough to like not be tempted to do the weight in training that I just should wait to the meet to do?
Yeah.
That's a whole nother deal right there. You have to kind of figure out how to do that, or have somebody who can have had enough competitive experience to kind of like keep you in check.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get the strength that you really need with just 5 sets of 5. 5 sets of 5 is going to get you a lot stronger. I'm sure that someone could do it, but it actually would be very hard to not take those heavier attempts, at least here and there. You have training sessions where maybe you do your 5x5, or maybe you do what's prescribed. And, you're doing sets of 5 and you get to that like 4th set, you're like, I could handle a little bit more weight. You put a quarter on there, that goes pretty smooth. And you're like, I might as well, you know what I mean? The next thing you know, you're kind of like maxing out. And I think that happens to a lot of powerlifters.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, I always feel like when I look at my training programs, I'm like so logical. It's so, on the one side there's like a little bit of sophistication to it because I'm, each thing I'm doing has a purpose. And then on the other side, I'm like, this is really simple, but I've obviously thought about it so much that it's like, it's probably not simple to the person who's like trying to figure out what I'm doing. But yeah, I mean, I think there has to be some sophistication in your training program because, I think the one classic thing that everyone who's a bodybuilder or powerlifter knows is like, any program can work, but no program can work forever. So you've got to be able to kind of like, introduce new stimuli in your training, so if it's like, what's better, training with sets of 10 or training with sets of 5? It's like, well, one's going to work for a while and then it's not going to work. And then the other, so it's like, you got to figure out a way to kind of utilize each sort of element of training effectively. And then also if you're trying to time it, so you have like your peak at a certain event, then you have to sort of order those, blocks of training or those sort of, and there's also training where you do like blocks. So you might do one thing for 4 weeks at a time and then the next thing. And then there's more of the conjugate where you're like, I'm going to do, like Brandon Lilly had the cube thing where you're like, I'm going to do a max this week, and then next week going to be reps, and then there's going to be like a speed training. So you're kind of rotating through different stimuli. So there's a lot of ways to do it, but
I think we have a bunch of questions for you, so maybe we can start to hammer through a couple of those.
Like, there's a lot. All right, let's. Well, you know what? Let's start on the nutrition aspect, because there's a few. One person wants to know, like, if you still follow the vertical diet, and then there's another one about protein. So, in essence, like, what has your nutrition looked like through the years? Has it changed as you've gotten older, or has it been consistent?
Okay, so I would say from about age 15 to 25, my most important staple was like burritos and also like a lot of hot wings. So, always seeking out a lot of protein and calories.
Get your pen out, kids.
I mean, it is true though. Like we used to lift at Gold's Gym, and Gold's Gym would close at 10, but also the burrito place would close at 10. So like, I gotta wrap this up by like 9:45 to like get my calories in after the workout. And then if I didn't, then I was like, all right, I got to go to get some wings later. So, but
it's good
I
protein.
do now kind of follow more like the vertical diet. I definitely prefer that. I do a lot of meals where it's like rice and ground beef or ground turkey. Those are kind of two staples for me. But I also, and this is kind of like more like the zone diet, I would say, where I will sort of organize certain meals around either having high protein, high carbs, and like really minimal fat. So that could be like, okay, I'm eating ground turkey and rice. It's a lot of protein and carbs, but very little fat. Or I could have a meal that's like high in protein and high in fat, but very little carbs. So that'd be like, or I'm gonna have like an omelet with a bunch of, bacon, or I'm gonna have a steak and maybe some like vegetables or like a salad, but I'm not gonna have like, bread and mashed potatoes.
Such a great way to eat too if you're traveling, because that allows you to kind of like pick and choose according like what restaurant you go to. It makes it more simple.
Then you can still eat the foods you like, but also if you sort of don't combine the carbs and the fat, like, which is kind of what I'm calling the zone dieting. I'm not making this up. It's just sort of something I've seen before. You're not combining the two different energy systems, so you're able to digest it a lot better. Like if I go to breakfast or my wife cooks and I'm like, all right, I just ate like 7 scrambled eggs and 4 strips of bacon and a bunch of whatever, I feel pretty good. But if I go and have like a piece of toast after that, I'm like, all right, I'm ready for a nap,
Oh, okay.
So it's just like that one little element of carbs kind of bogs it down.
A question about that real quick. Do you feel like that you wouldn't have felt like that from 15 to 25? Do you feel like you could just eat anything together and you wouldn't feel that? But as you got older, is that why? Or did you feel that way before too?
That's a good question. I think a big element for me is like, every couple of years, I figure out a new trick in the kitchen, and it's like my quality of life has improved. And you learn like, oh, I learned how to cook a steak, or I know how to scramble eggs, or I bought a rice cooker and I don't have to like heat up, refrigerated rice, which is pretty awful. So pretty much at my gym and at home, I have like a rice cooker. So I just always have, that white rice just ready to go. And then, I know how to just make a ton of ground beef or ground turkey, or cook, like a Costco package of steaks. And so once I learned how to kind of deal with actually making food, there's like, okay, I'm living better.
And then probably pretty simple too. Like if you're trying to gain weight, you probably just weigh yourself a little bit here and there. If you're trying to lose weight, check the scale a little bit here and there, just kind of see where you're going.
My default is always gaining weight. Like if I'm not really thinking about I always gain weight because I eat a lot. That's just, so when I do a meet, that's when I'm like, all right, I'm going to start dropping the snacks, and then I got to start controlling the portions a little bit. So then it's always like, all right, I need to make sure my protein is in check, but I'm just not like eating superfluous stuff, or I'm like monitoring how much, rice I'm eating or whatever. So for me, it's always a matter of like, if I want to lean out, I need to try. If I want to gain weight, I don't do anything. I just eat. So
yeah, and at 270, like the next time you compete, are you going to try to get down to 242, or what do you think you'll?
I'd say normally my like kind of in between competition weight is probably like mid 250s, 257, 258, somewhere in there. So definitely just bulked up a little more as a result of eating a lot of my kids' snacks in the house. So that is one challenge for me. But when I compete, I'm sure I will. It's hard for me to get motivated to diet unless I have like a meet. And then I'm like, all right, my training feels good, but training feels a lot better when your protein is like really high. And so then that sort of becomes more intrinsically motivating. And then if you are, I don't know if I would do like 220 again, but if I was, trying to get to 220, I'd have to get my body weight down to like 240. And that would take a lot of consistent eating, but also having that sort of fear of missing the weight is pretty good motivation to like eat on a schedule. So.
Right. And this actually question ties into something we were talking about in the gym. Somebody asked, how do you balance being a dad with training? Do you have less time to train now?
Yep. I have a lot less time to train for sure.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think even from when my wife was pregnant with our first kid and she was just pregnant, I didn't want to be like, so that was when I was like, all right, I'm not going to go to the gym for 4 hours. I'm going to try to keep it to like 75 minutes and just do the important stuff and like not, bullshit with my friends too much. And I'll kind of like figure out which accessories are like meaningful and which ones are just kind of like unnecessary, So now it's, it's always about like kind of paring down what do I need? And then like, what do I kind of not, not need to do? So yeah, that's pretty straightforward, I think, but it's a reality. It's not easy. I think the toughest thing for me, cause like we have 3 toddlers right now. And so in the last few years, like sleeping has been, reduced a lot. So that's,
there you go.
That's not really something you can work around. Yeah. So that was right after the middle 2 were born. Then we have one more daughter. So yeah, there was not a lot of, just not a lot of sleep that you'd ideally want. You're like 8 or 9 hours of sleep as a lifter, and it just wasn't.
So you have 4 kids, right? And there's a set of twins in there, right?
Yeah. So the oldest is 14, the twin boys who are 5, and a daughter's 4. So
2 kids at the same time that are 5. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And hard.
All right. Another question. That's interesting. Should young lifters try to get stronger while maintaining a weight class, or should they try to get bigger and break plateaus?
Yeah. So one of the slogans I always put in my hashtags is "No Skinny Champions." So this is not exclusively for like weight gain, but it's really more the concept of like having sort of self-limiting sort of like mantras. Which would be like, I want to get big, but I don't want to lose my abs. And we're like, you're skinny. You need to get big. Nobody cares about your abs right now. Or, I want to get bigger, but not too big. So there are all those things. Yeah, I think if you restrict yourself for some arbitrary reason, that can be like the theme of your whole career is like always kind of, not getting as excited as you want because you're not getting the results you want because maybe there's something you're doing that's kind of slowing you down.
Yeah.
Another one for me is like, I think with a lot of RPE training, there's like it's a really great concept, but a lot of people overthink it and they basically outsmart themselves out of like training hard enough.
Yeah.
So that's something that's again, like with the thing with Louis, it's like, you have to train hard. You have to introduce a lot of stress. And if you're just like kind of measuring it too well, then you never get big.
Mm-hmm. That's actually probably one of the reasons why AMRAPs for you are so good, because you actually brush up on failure,
What I thought about later, after I've been doing it for a long time, is I was like, okay, if there was a way of kind of taking Dorian Yates and doing it as like a power lifter, that's kind of it. Where his training was like, all right, I'm going to do like my pullovers for just a warm-up set and then a set of max reps. And then I'm going to do my bent over rows for like a warm up and then like a set of max reps. And it's kind of in that 6 to 8 rep range.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I was doing. A lot of like sets of 5 to 8. And it would just be like, all right, 1 set of max reps. And, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll feel great as far as your body later on in life, but it also does work. Mm-hmm. And, certainly it's like that intensity of effort that's there that kind of makes it work. For me, it worked well too, because okay, so a lot of people, if you're gonna like squat and do like a set of 8, for example, your form will deteriorate as you go from like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to the point where it might not be productive or it might be like dangerous. Same thing for deadlifts or for bench.
Yeah.
But for me, I was always able to execute my technique right up until the end, and a lot of that is like experience. But really, what makes it work is that you have an idea of what you need to do for your technique. And all the sort of the mental distress that kind of creeps into your mind while you're squatting, where you're just like, just want to get this over with. Why am I doing this? Like I could just stop now and it'll be fine. Just like just start the last one. So if you can take the time to always, like, let's say you're squatting and your traps are hurting, you're like kind of tired in your lower back, you're wobbling, you're getting out of breath. But if you can sort of take the time to sort of say, let me stay tight, take a couple like little in-between breaths until I can take a strong breath, brace and still like execute the full squat. If you can do good reps until the end, to me, like AMRAP is as many reps as possible, not as many reps as impossible. You're not trying to fail. You're just doing as many as you can do with confidence and then stopping.
Yeah.
But certainly pushing through that like mental distress of like, hey, that's enough, But not everybody wants to do that. And for whatever reason I did. So it worked well for me. Other people, it doesn't work. And other people, the first rep is the best one. And then, and that means that your training needs to be kind of like tailored for that, certainly. So.
You mentioned earlier you have like some neck pain or like a nerve thing, and you think it's kind of throwing your bench press off. Have you ever spoken to any other lifters about that and tried to figure out how to get that to fire better? I know Jill Sullivan, when he had that barbell like kind of wrap around his neck when he was doing that heavy squat, that he ran into a lot of issues, and that whole he had a whole side that was just like shut off. And he really struggled. Have you ever communicated with anybody like that to try to?
Yeah, no, I've definitely talked directly with Joe because I know that he pretty much he did it in a different way than I did it, but he had pretty much the exact same injury. Now, him and I had both competed as like 220s and 242s. We both had exactly the same benches of like 501 at 220, I think 529 or 523 at 242. Wow. And so he had done the thing where the bar just kind of like folded over his neck, and then he said he thought he was okay, but then like about 6 weeks had gone by and like he couldn't even bench 135 without like problems. And the same thing happened to me, not squatting, but I was doing some like kind of like a dragon flag. So I was trying to do some ab training on one of those incline sit-up boards. And I just wound up like putting way too much pressure on my neck.
Oh, I see.
Thought it was okay. And then, it was obviously not. And so I went like, 6 weeks, and it was like I was doing some bench and I was like, bench kind of sucks. And then one day I was like doing 135 and I couldn't even just like push it up without flaring. And I was like, that's really, really messed up. So, we pretty much had the same thing. We both had our bench kind of dipped down to where we're like, okay, we're doing like 350 or something like that, so you lost like 30% of your strength or whatever the number was. And I had it for about 3 years, and the same guy that helped him to kind of like regain it, Jake Benson, like I wound up talking to him and we worked together for a little while, but I didn't really go through with the whole program. I think my life was not conducive enough for that. So I did not, it's my fault. I didn't really go through with the whole thing, and I was just like, I can't keep up with this. It's like pretty rigorous. And so I was like, it's going to have to happen in the future sometime if it does. But it was like, okay, I can't. So my bench is, I've been able to get up to like around 440, but that's still like 80% of former benches. So it's like, not that exciting to try to make a 400 bench in a meet when you've done like over 500.
There's another question about calisthenics. Now that you just mentioned those dragon flags, your opinion on calisthenics and how they help with your powerlifting, and if they do.
I think the only example that I would say, I guess two, I've always done a lot of pull-ups, so pull-ups are pretty great. I think doing high reps with body weight is a really good way to build up your lats. Sometimes I think that's better than weighted pull-ups for me. But like I've talked to like Julius Maddox, and he was really big on this like whole push-up sort of regiment that he was doing. He's pretty good at benching. So
and he's absolutely massive.
Yeah, he's like a 400-pound guy. And the way he explained it to me was, and he had also worked with Josh Bryant, but Josh had him basically do like 10 sets of 5 push-ups, and you're basically just reversing really, fast and forcefully at the bottom, so it's to build up your chest strength. So he said he did 10 sets of 5, and then eventually had him work up to 10 sets of 40. So, you could think of like 400 push-ups for a 400-pound guy. And he said that like really blew up his like off the chest strength. And so after I'd had this neck injury, which also like really affected my tricep, not so much my chest, I was like, well, I can train my chest pretty well. So I started, implementing that, and I had gotten up to the 400 push-ups. And if nothing else, it was fun. My chest was pretty pumped up and like it looked good. And, I think, if all things are healthy, that can be a good strategy. I know in Westside, I've talked to Louis, and he would kind of explain certain bench protocols of like wide grip benching, where you would, kind of start with like a 6x6 and do that for a little while. And then you would take a new weight and do 8 sets of 8. And then eventually it would be like a 10x10. And so I thought it was pretty interesting that Louis was like, the idea here was not doing some exercise and then over the course of time increasing the weight, but it was like using a certain exercise where the focus of the workout was increasing the sort of the volume. So obviously a push-up is your body weight. And so if you're using a weight and the goal is just to increase the workload with that weight, not just to like do a rep range and then increase the weight, I was like, oh, it's such an obvious sort of thing to think about once you've identified it. But so that's something I try to utilize in training with a lot of people is, body weight stuff can be good for some people. But yeah, I think what I learned from that was like, okay, there's a lot of ways to really benefit from ramping up rep ranges into these like really high rep ranges. I mean, you see a lot of like CrossFit women who are huge from doing like 300 squats a day I don't know why it doesn't work for the men, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely some benefit to doing a lot of reps of calisthenics. So
Those CrossFit dudes are pretty big too in that way.
I feel like the women look like they're more jacked than the men.
They do.
Exponentially, yeah.
They look super jacked.
But I think certain calisthenics don't work because your body weight is a 1 rep max for certain things,
Yeah, yeah.
So you can do like 20 muscle ups. It's like probably not,
Fair. All right. And I don't know if this is something you think about, but this is a correct question from Kenton Kramer. What is a way to bulletproof tendons and ligaments?
Well, I think it depends on which ones. So like, for example, I was saying before when I was trying to, build up my conventional deadlift, I wanted to make sure my hamstring tendons wouldn't, snap. And so I was just doing some GHRs with body weight. It wasn't even that much. It'd probably be like 20 reps in a workout, but it was just to address it. Yeah. And I don't know. I think you probably need to figure an exercise out that works for any one of the body parts, there's no one exercise that's going to fix all the tendons, obviously. So,
Yeah.
If it's your pecs, then I would think probably doing something like flies are going to kind of help build that up, letting the stretch kind of sink in. Or if it's, if it's your quads, maybe you need to do like, honestly, a lot of the knees over toes guys stuff I think is really good for like building up your knee sort of like structure.
That was a question here too.
So I've done a lot of like, I like to do a lot of, the things in his regimen. I don't follow what he does exactly, but I'll utilize some of the things that he's kind of put in the videos. So like this is not from his, but it's sort of a bastardized version. I'll start my lower body workouts by walking backwards on the treadmill, and I'll put it, pretty steep, like 13 degrees or 13, and I'll walk slowly, but it's just like, a couple minutes of that. My quads are all pumped up. Any sort of tendon sort of stiffness feels like it's improved dramatically. A lot of like just body weight split squats or kind of sissy squats on the toes seems to like, most people, if you did that, you'd be like, oh, this hurts the knees. But if you did it with a strategy of like, okay, I'm going to start by supporting my weight and then build it up, then you will improve that sort of tendon quality in your knee.
Figuring out ways to get a lot of blood flow to an area seems to be critical.
Yeah, what I thought he was really, really a genius at is putting everything into context. One, so you can sort of say like, why are you doing each thing? And then two, teaching how to do regressions of everything, which is like pretty, if you want to be a trainer, like learning how to teach people regressions is like huge.
Yeah.
So that's where like, I would always, kind of fall into that camp of like, well, like a Bulgarian split squat is great because it makes you balance, it makes you stretch your back leg, and it makes you put a lot of weight in your front. But if you can't balance and you're not flexible, it's like you're going to be overwhelmed and you're not going to really build it up. And if you're not strong, so if you have more than one variable, it's like, okay, you're probably overwhelmed. But if you can like hold on, and then you can like put your front foot up, or you can limit the range of motion, and you can just kind of build one of those elements by itself, then you can progress to where you can kind of address the next element. So yeah, I think those are pretty helpful. A lot of people do stuff for the triceps with like bands, and I think high reps certainly for like your tricep tendons is a good thing. So.
I have a question, just actually this is for me, but when you're squatting and deadlifting, are you thinking of anything with your feet? Or like are you just thinking of anything with your feet or not really?
No.
No? Okay.
And maybe when I squat, like my foot pressure, but not, I don't think of like twisting my feet into the ground or like, I don't know, spreading the floor or anything like too much like that.
Okay.
I think for me, it's usually like just bracing the core, and yeah, I don't
Are you actively trying to drive your knees out, or is that just like how you squat?
I used to, but really what I think about now is not like trying to be, like on like Ninja Warrior or like pressing your feet out in 2 different walls and like wedging yourself in there, but really more like I just want the inner thighs to kind of just move out of the way so they're more relaxed, so my knees open, but I'm not like trying to force them open.
Got it.
So it's really just more to kind of like create space to move.
There's a question here about your numbers in terms of your new goals as far as squat and deadlift.
I mean, for deadlift, I've always wanted to kind of, get into the 900s with, either sumo or conventional. Sumo, I've done 881, so I haven't made it to 900 like in just a straight up, deadlift. For squat, I've always wanted to get to 826. That was the Kirk Karwoski's, like, he had a number that was the 242 record for a long time. And even though it's not the record anymore, that was sort of just like a milestone that I sort of envisioned myself getting to. And I've done 804, and that's kind of on the horizon. So that's certainly like a target for me, just because of that sort of like, setting the goal once. And then like, even though other people have like obliterated it, it's like, well, still like to get to that. So.
Was there like any sort of like particular day? You did mention like you came to super training many years ago and competed, and you did like a 600-pound deadlift. A year later, you were in like the mid 7s. Was there any like particular day where you're like, I think this is like a thing. I think it's going to turn into something.
Well, I'd already been competing in powerlifting, I think, at that point. So I was definitely already committed to lifting, but sometimes I would just be like so intense in the training that when I would do a meet, I was like, I'm going to do something else for a little while. So like after my first meet, I think I spent from like November through June, so like 7 months building up for this first meet. And I was like, I'm going to take a break. I did like jiu-jitsu for like 6 weeks. And then I was like, all right, I'm tired of this. I'm going to go lift again. And then I kind of dabbled with some Olympic lifting. So I did some competitions, for like 6 months with that. And then the tactical strength challenge, I did it a couple times. I mean, I'd kind of enjoyed doing the kettlebell stuff, but just having like a sort of a specific kind of target to train for was pretty interesting and satisfying the 2 times that I did that. So,
all right, Mark, you're getting leaner and leaner, but you always enjoy the food you're eating. So how you doing it?
I got a secret, man. It's called Good Life Protein.
Okay, tell me about that.
I've been doing some Good Life Protein. We've been talking on the show for a really long time of certified Piedmontese beef, and you can get that under the umbrella of Good Life Proteins, which also has chicken breast, chicken thighs, sausage, shrimp, scallops, all kinds of different fish, salmon, tilapia. The website has nearly any kind of meat that you can think of. Lamb is another one that comes to mind. And so I've been utilizing and kind of using some different strategy, kind of depending on the way that I'm eating. So if I'm doing a keto diet, I'll eat more fat, and that's where I might get the sausage, and I might get their 80-20 grass-fed, grass-finished ground beef. I might get bacon. And there's other days where I kind of do a little bit more bodybuilder style, where the fat is, might be like 40 grams or something like that. And then I'll have some of the leaner cuts of the certified Piedmontese beef.
This is one of the reasons why like neither of us find it hard to stay in shape, because we're always enjoying the food we're eating. And protein, you talk about protein leverage all the time. It's satiating and helps you feel full.
I look forward to every meal. And I can surf and turf,
Yeah.
I could cook up some, chicken thighs or something like that and have some shrimp with it, or I could have some steak. I would say, the steak, it keeps going back and forth for me on my favorites. So it's hard for me to lock one down, but I really love the bavette steaks.
Yeah.
And then I also love the ribeyes as well.
You can't go wrong with the ribeyes. So guys, if you guys want to get your hands on some really good meat, you can head to goodlifeproteins.com and use code POWER for 20% off any purchases made on the website, or you can use code POWERPROJECT to get an extra 5% off if you subscribe and save to any meats that are a recurring purchase.
This is the best meat in the world.
Yeah, and I mean, it was actually pretty cool as some of the things I did to train for like that 5 minutes of kettlebell snatching. Definitely pretty grueling, but it actually made my grip quite a bit stronger, and I got so lean that actually my belt at its tightest would have to kind of like go in between my ribs and hips. So I was like, okay, because it's getting a little ridiculous.
Yeah, it must burn a ton of calories doing kettlebell for 5 minutes straight.
But certainly the breakthrough for the deadlifting was I had tried to switch from conventional to sumo like a number of times and just had like really kind of poor success. And eventually when I started using the block pulls where you can like handle heavier weights and you learn how to kind of like wedge your hips into place, that was where my sumo just kind of took off. And I was like, oh, I'm going to be able to pass my conventional. And then, it was like from 1 year, 650 conventional. Next year it was like 740 sumo at the same time. And, I just kept going from there. So that was a huge breakthrough. It was just kind of stumbling across the right exercise. So.
It was pretty amazing when you came up to the gym and you trained with Stan Efferding, and Stan hit a PR that day, and you hit a big PR that day. I think you squatted a little over 800, and Stan squatted like
900.
Yeah, that was pretty. Both you guys were just huge too. I remember Stan just looking like a refrigerator at that time.
Yeah, I have to say I never really liked Stan's squat form, but I did appreciate how massive he was, and I always said he was one of my favorite lifters because he'll just go to a meet and always bench press 600 pounds. Mm-hmm. So that was
Yeah,
squatting and deadlifting is nice, but like a big bench is still more important. So
yeah, Stan tended to lean forward on his squats, but he basically just kind of used he kind of used his lower back, which kind of makes sense because he didn't have a huge structure of
he's very like
hips.
Hip and back dominant, where his like knees kind of taper in.
Super wide. Yeah, it was interesting trying to work with him in squat. It was we had to take his stance out. I thought we would have to take his stance in. We tried some stuff and it didn't work well. And then also he would descend so slowly. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I think you need to get down there faster. And then he'd try to get down there faster and he'd lose his balance. And I was like, I don't think you can have your head down like that. He's like looking at his shoes while he's squatting. And I'm like, I think you need to have your head up more. Yeah. And of course he'd put his head up more and it would mess him up. So I was like, we just got to work with what we got here.
Yeah. Cause you can see his back is huge. He had a lot of hip strength in that wide stance. So, and what I was saying is like, I don't think the muscle mass that he has right at his knee insertion is like as developed as like all the meat in the upper part of the thigh. So if you were to try to, narrow it up and get more knee flexion, I feel like that would just be kind of playing into his, maybe not to his strengths. So
it's pretty crazy to have that contest, the backyard meet of the century, where we had yourself and Stan and Eric Lillibridge and Baby Slayer. What an interesting nickname.
Pete Rubish was there. So
yeah, Pete Rubish. There was just a lot of awesome lifters at that contest, and I remember like somebody broke a 45-pound plate.
Like on their head, or
I was like, we need to like keep that plate. No, I don't know if someone dropped it or whatever, but like I've never seen a broken 40, like just completely broken in half. Mm-hmm. I think it was, obviously it was an accident, but
I met Pete Rubish for the first time, and I was just kind of like doing my warm ups, and he's like, I lift a lot better when I'm angry. I was like, oh, hey, nice to meet you. I was like, he was in his own like zone for that.
Yeah, I remember when
he's a pretty awesome dude. So
he's amazing, and now he's doing like marathons and stuff. I remember when he squatted at this meet, he like had one of the worst squats I've ever seen. Like he nearly died on the squat, and I was like, well, he's got to discontinue. Like there's no way he's going to go. It was on his second attempt, and then he went out there and he went heavier, and he made his third attempt, and I was like, oh my god, this guy's an animal.
It's got angrier and angrier.
Yeah, he got madder and madder.
Got to turn up a little bit.
Do you think when you're done powerlifting, when you kind of hit maybe some of the lifts that you're kind of looking for, or kind of go out more on your own terms, do you think you'll get into maybe something else? Maybe
you mentioned not marathons.
you mentioned jiu-jitsu. Like, is that something that you think you would like to pursue, or?
No, I mean, I like coaching people, so I'll just kind of do my lifting, do my coaching. I think if I'm, I haven't really gotten to that point yet where I'm like, decidedly retired. So I don't quite know yet, but yeah, I don't know. I'm not foreseeing a lot of running in my future. I don't think jiu-jitsu is in the cards either. I don't really see like, bodybuilding as sort of a transition. So yeah, I don't know. If there's something that sort of motivates me to lift, then I'll just do that. And that's, I'm sure I'll probably never be just fully done with the gym. So
it's always something to pursue in there.
Yeah. Or, as my kids grow older and they're all playing sports now, and, so I would love to sort of, kind of support them in all their sports endeavors and whatever else. So I think I'll just kind of have to, again, that's kind of more like being a coach again and sort of being like a supporter. Maybe lend my, my knowledge and expertise on lifting as much as they would need that. So, my older son, when he was 8, he did a deadlifting only meet. So, it was fun. We trained him for that. And it was like,
did he cheat? Did he go sumo?
He definitely went sumo. But it was cool because he did most of the training. Like, I think there's always that sort of fear people have, like, oh, I'm going to stunt my kids' growth if I make them, lift. But I also would sort of think like, maybe if you were like just making your kid do like a shit ton of squats, but I can't imagine like compelling some child to just do like high volume squats. Like, you're going to get your 8-year-old to be like, all right, we're going to do like a small of program. And you're just going to be sore and depressed all the time.
We're doing
like,
squat every day.
Oh man. Yeah. So that was a couple years ago. This was like 2022, I think. But when we were training when he was 8 to do his meet, like the workout was right on the board, and it would be like kind of like a CrossFit workout. Like, all right, you're going to climb the rope, you're going to do some box jumps, you're going to push the sled around, then you're going to do some push-ups and sit-ups. So it's just like
those squats. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a lot of, just like obvious stuff to do in the gym. That's not like just heavy lifting. And then at the end of the workout, we would deadlift, and it was always like sub max. We're not like trying to get his like form good. And then at the meet, just let him kind of go for it. I remember the day after the meet, he had warmed up to like a PR in the warm up area, and then he had all PRs on the platform.
Nice.
And the next day he was like super cranky. It's like he didn't know why, but I was like, I know why.
Why am I so mad?
That's great.
Just like, I was like, he's just a wreck the next day. Not like he couldn't physically feel it, but he was just kind of like, just like sometimes kids are just kind of in bad moods or they feel like they're a little bit sick or something. So.
Any more questions in there? Or were we
There's
good?
a lot more, but
maybe,
all right. Let's
maybe ask a couple more.
Okay, so you squatted big weights with a wide stance for a very long time. How did you keep your hips so healthy?
That's a good question.
Do you stretch?
I think I would definitely do some stretching. I mean, not like, I guess I would just sort of think of it as the normal amount that I always did. So I had like a background in gymnastics, so I had some stretches that I would do from time to time. But I think if your form is good and you always use the full range of motion, like you'd maintain it pretty well. I think the sumo deadlifts kept a lot of strength in there too. Front squatting to a deeper depth than you're going to like low bar squat to, I think kind of bulletproofs you a little bit as well. My front squat would be also very wide with the hips wide open, just because you need flexibility in your ankles and your groin to get a deep squat. And in a lot of my best meets, I would train intensely, but I wouldn't miss any squat reps and like training build up to a meet. So that was, that is definitely an important factor, because there were times when I did miss reps and I was like, oh, I just crunched, like my hip and then enough of those. And it's like, eventually my hips start, I have like an impingement in my, like kind of that impinges when I internally rotate my right hip. So eventually that just kind of got worse over time. And that actually happened from doing like Olympic lifting, where I had done like a power clean and then it turned into like a deep squat where I'd caught it in kind of a wide stance and then just got pushed down a little too far and felt my hip kind of like fold in a little bit and a little pop. And it was like, okay, well, that didn't feel good. And then, many years later, it kind of got worse and worse. And now it's like, so now I just narrowed my stance. I still keep the hips wide open, but the stance is more narrow, and that suits me fine. Just sort of adapting and using more quads and back instead of as much hips.
Did you utilize some deloads and stuff like that, or did you just kind of progressively train a little heavier going into a competition?
Yeah, I don't really ever do any specific deloads. I think my training was just kind of I was thinking of like, what's the right amount to tolerate from week to week. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you'd kind of be forced to take a deload if you had to like travel or something. But no, I didn't really do a lot of deloading. I just kind of had a sense of like what's the right amount of training for myself. So,
do you know any tips for getting a strong?
Doesn't mean I don't think deloading is useful, but it's
just
not like my sort of strategy most of the time.
Gotcha. Tips for getting a stronger sumo deadlift lockout. I struggle with the lockout on my sumo at the top.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things that I would say. The first thing, I mean, for me, the most important thing for sumo was always just doing the block pulls. It just really strengthens your hips. If your hips are not engaging, like with that kind of lateral, sort of like abduction or lateral pressure when you're at any point of the lift, you can tend to kind of fall forward. So that could be at the bottom or the top. Certainly for me, the conventional deadlifting was always meant to kind of give me the strength to kind of extend through at the top. So I would also sort of think for sumo, sometimes as the bar passes your knees, your grip and your hands have to be able to kind of like negotiate passing your thighs or, moving into the lockout position. So just the exact position on the bar needs to be kind of like thought through.
Yeah.
I would always do my sumos with my underhand, left hand about 1 inch wider than my overhand. And the reason for that for me was that I felt like, I'd always build up the calluses under my ring finger the most. So the weight's kind of directly hanging onto the ring finger the most. Oh. And so if you kind of rotate your hand about your ring finger, it sits about 1 inch wider. So for me, that felt right. And then my underhand, you can't really see me behind the desk, but the underhand hand would kind of fall past the thigh more easily. So I always kind of liked the idea that if you slightly widened your grip, that would allow you to kind of use your lats and extend your thoracic spine more as you locked out. So you kind of utilize your upper body strength. But sometimes the narrower grip gives you a little more leverage and speed at the start, and that can carry you through. I think for me, my grip was always like just strong enough. So if I was narrow, it would be hard to like have that extra pull at the very top. So the wider suited me slightly better.
Did you do particular stuff for your grip or your forearms or even like your wrist? Your forearms and wrists are super jacked.
Honestly, I have done certain things, but I think I grew up playing baseball. And if you spend a lot of time swinging a club around, you build up your forearms a lot. And most baseball players have a lot of forearm development. So I did do a lot of pull-ups where I would kind of like cuff the bar, kind of in that sort of like gymnast grip where you're not like hanging, but you're keeping your wrist flexed. I think doing a lot of dumbbells with thicker dumbbells, that really
thicker
would like
handles,
pump up my forearms, or just get this like kind of Popeye thing going at the end, where I think because you kind of tuck your elbows a little bit and then there's a little flare. So that back and forth against like a lot of inertia, that got the forearms pretty good. But no, I mean, I don't think that doing like wrist curls or wrist rollers or things like that was never like a part of my training. And I'd certainly heard other people sort of liken those things as really not helpful for your grip. It kind of comes down more to like finger strength as far as having the grip strength you need to deadlift. So what I would try to do for the grip strength would be, the two things would be, one, doing some like axle just holds or deadlifts where you're just gripping like a smooth 2-inch diameter bar. That was pretty helpful. And then sometimes I would do, sometimes like just doing sets of like maybe RDLs or sets of reps where you're just not letting go and you're just not re-gripping. You're just trying to make sure you can sort of lock your grip in and keep it there for a long time. But yeah, that's not really like super sophisticated of a thought, but just having sets that last longer.
I think there's a lot, but this is a very good question. For you, before doing heavy lifts or lifts and meets, are you thinking anything? Is there anything going on with your mindset, preparation before any of these lifts?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing would be like the build up to the meet. For me, the strongest motivation was always, if in my mind, I'm like, I know I could lift a certain weight, then my training was motivated. Like I would think of it like if you watch like, Marvel or Spider-Man and there's like a sort of like a multiverse, there's like one world where I have lifted these weights and then there's the reality where I have not lifted these weights. And that's like very stressful, two worlds that are totally at odds with each other. So that was very motivating. But in the meet itself, I think the training had kind of always, like whenever you're training, I think there's this idea like, okay, there's going to come a point where I'm trying the PR at the meet and I need my training to sort of be contextualized with that. So if I'm just kind of dicking around in the gym, but I'm not putting myself in the context of like, am I lifting 80% just because, or am I doing it because I'm practicing what I'm going to do against that like PR? Even things like rehearsing my walkout in the mirror with no weights, just, so getting everything dialed in. And then I think the thing that I always thought of, like, I felt like the meet always was either going to kind of go really well or not well based on how I would squat. I think the thing that I would think of for the squatting is one is the need to not get psyched out when you pick up the weight, and by definition, it should feel heavy because it's like a weight you haven't done before. So if you pick it up and then you get psyched out and you approach the technique differently than you normally would with, you're cautious, you go slower or you go faster, anything like that, then that's like, you've already lost. So that was one thing that just kind of consciously, I was like, all right, I need to get psyched up so that I can execute it and know that even if I descend, there's a chance I won't come up, or there's a chance I'll get hurt. Maybe something pops when I get to the bottom, but I will definitely not lift the weight if I'm not aggressive. So I think a couple things that I would not visualize, but I kind of thought of like a sniper who was like, you take all these hundreds of practice shots, and then there's a moment where you just have to trust all the training and just go for it. Mm-hmm. So that was definitely one mindset. And then there's, just like I guess this is another like sort of war thought, but my grandfather was in the army in World War II, and he was on like D-Day. So I always imagine like you're in this situation where it's like, okay, the only chance you have is like sprinting towards all the gunfire and not sort of just being cautious. So there's just that thought of like, all right, you just got to be able to go for it because you don't know what's going to happen, but you know that you're prepared, and something is, it's only going to be good if you just go for it. So getting psyched up is definitely pretty important, but there's like a total rationale or like, pragmatic thought to like, all right, you have to be aggressive or you're screwed.
Gotcha. Aggressive, but maybe a little bit calm too.
But yeah, like the sniper thing, it's like, you're not just trying something you haven't practiced like 100 times that all led up to that moment. So, you can make subtle adjustments, and then at the moment it's like, all right, you got to trust all the things that you've done. Mm-hmm. And, I want my first 2 squat attempts to like build my confidence into that last lift. So I don't have to sort of like, a lot of people were like, well, I want to hit like 500. My best is 480. So I'm going to do 485 first. And then I'll, it's like, you didn't decide if you wanted to just make a little PR or if you wanted to make the best PR you could make. So you're like hedging against what if I miss the 500? I don't want to have no PRs. And you can only prioritize like one strategy. So for me, it was always like, let me prioritize the strategy that sets me up for like the best PR I could make for today. And that usually means starting lighter and kind of building the confidence in, and not needing to like almost lift the weight to know that I can probably make the weight, which sort of says like you kind of lack the confidence or just the like you're not relying on all the training you already did and knowing you're prepared for it. So for deadlifting, I would definitely have to kind of go and like kind of give myself a little cursing out, and get pretty angry and sort of, motivated to be aggressive. Because I think in a deadlift, you don't get to feel the weight before you pick it up, like a bench or a squat. You've got to sort of be on like 100% by the time you actually try to pick the weight up. And so if you're like, I wonder how this will feel, it'll be really heavy and you won't make it. So definitely sort of needing to kind of get yourself amped up before that. So
let's take like one more question, and I think we should bring it in for the day.
Okay. Actually, this goes into the BBBC program. How does your body handle the amount of volume in the BBBC routine? Truly amazing. Huge fan from CKM Furs.
Okay, so the BBBC, that's Boss Barbell Club. The strength training programs that I've either like given people as a coach or just kind of like followed for myself, there's definitely a lot of volume, but I think the way that it breaks down for me is it's almost like it could be kind of done with sort of like a template, and kind of like I think there's an element of like conjugated training where like when I do my squats, for example, I'll usually squat on Monday and I'll squat on Wednesday. And as I was saying before, if I do back squats on Monday and then I follow that with pause, high bar squats, and then on Wednesday I'm doing front squats, it's a lot of volume, but each thing sort of serves a specific purpose. So the low bar squats, I'm practicing my technique. I'm handling heavy weights. The high bar squats, I'm building my technique. I'm building my stability at the bottom, but also I'm building like my quads. And you're basically like if you're really good at leveraging like your hips and your back with the low bar, then the question is like, are you good at leveraging and are you strong where you just like cock strong in your quads and your glutes and your back? So in a pause high bar squat, I'd be like in a more narrow stance. And so it's like you're taking away the leverage of your hips, like, so usually when you hear somebody talk about a squat, you're like, you sit back or spread your knees. And those are both like lateral motions that create leverage. But the other element is just like how forcefully can you push like up and down. And so then the paused high bar squat is like, what's your pure strength? And then the low bar is sort of like, how much can you multiply that? Can you multiply it by 10% or 15% or, 110, 115%? So it's sort of like building leverage. And then there's also like building just pure strength. And then the front squatting is for hypertrophy, and also has a direct strength carryover for sumo. So I think knowing like sort of each element has a sort of a place and what it does, that allows it to kind of function well. Also, one of the most important lessons that I learned was like, you can train while you're sore. That was like a huge limitation for like a long, long time for me. And then once I was like, oh, I can have sore quads and squat and get stronger. Oh, that's like pretty powerful. And when I was in high school and college, it definitely was like following that like 90s bodybuilding sort of style where you're like, all right, I'll do the quads, then I'll wait like 5 days. And if they're not recovered, I'll wait another day and maybe another day. So once I started like increasing the frequency, I was like, oh, that was like a huge game changer for me.
Was there a person that's inspired you to get into powerlifting? And also like, who's your favorite powerlifter?
Yeah, I don't know. I would just say, I think when I was first getting into powerlifting and I learned who Ed Cohn was, I was like, okay, that guy's the greatest. And certainly watching his, kind of seeing his numbers and some of the footage was like very, very cool. The first time I saw him in person, I remember I was at the Arnold and I was with this guy, Craig Terry. He was deadlifting and I was like backstage by the deadlifting only meet. And I see this guy from like at least 100 feet away who's like very short, but like extremely wide. I was seeing from kind of his back. And I was like, that looks like the wrong proportions for a person. And then I was like, that has to be Ed Cohn. And it's like the back was like much wider than like the height of his spine. And I was like, okay, I've never seen that before. And this is while he was like still really competing, or maybe he was just done.
Put together in a different way, that's for sure.
I was like, that dude's, he's got a unique build for sure. And so like, yeah, he was definitely one of the sort of the inspiring sort of, and favorite lifters for a long time. But like now I definitely watch, when I was lifting, I think Stan was one of my favorite lifters. Just, I appreciated the, just being huge at the same time as, putting up big totals. And now, I definitely like watching John Hack. It's like a 200-pound guy benching 600 pounds. Like that's extremely impressive. Does the 900-pound deadlifts, routinely. And then I've been watching Colton Engelbrecht for like probably like a year. I'm just like, okay, this guy's very awesome in terms of his lifts, but also a lot of this sort of the form tendencies I see that he does are similar to the form that I, maybe in my dreams envisioned that I was using. And he's like, 24, he's like already the best in the world. And I started lifting when I was 24 and I was pretty trash as like a lifter. So, so it's cool to see that like new, era of lifter where it's like, and I'm not saying you learn from me, but the idea that, you're like the knowledge that's kind of gone through the different generations. So like the talent is as good, if not better than ever, but the knowledge is like that they're starting off with is like way better for sure. Yeah. And I know as coach, I'd competed or kind of gone down to Australia and, done stuff down there. And so, that was when his coach was like just a lifter. And so, I can see kind of the generations kind of evolving. So it's very cool to see young lifters that are very impressive.
Where's your gym located at?
So Boss Barbell Club is in Mountain View, California. That's like kind of around San Jose.
So. Where can people find you? And where can they find out more information about Boss Barbell and stuff like that?
You can go online. It's just bossbarbellclub.com. bossbarbell.com. You can, if you want to, do some coaching or come in and do some sessions, you can email me, dan@bossbarbell.com. And I'll do some coaching with people either online or in person. So
thanks a lot for coming to Davis today and meeting up with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. My pleasure.
I think people are going to be fired up listening to this. Strength is never weakness. Weakness is never strength. Catch you guys later. Bye.